Joining us now, my very good, brilliant friend, Andy McCarthy, best-selling author. You should have read his book, Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. I feel like we're going to need a part two. And of course, he's former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney, and you see him on Fox and over at NRO as well. And Andy joins us now via Skype. Andy, always so good to have you. And my first question right off the bat, when I heard the figure for this, which I'm going to ask you how we got to that number, but where normally with, me pretending to be a lawyer, you an actual lawyer, when you have damages like this, the damages go to someone who has lost out financially, someone who was defrauded or affected, etc. But there doesn't seem to be, there's no fraud here. So how does this end up? Who is the victim and who gets the money?
Dana, you don't need a JD for this. You need LSD. That's the only way I think you could actually figure out where they came up with this number. So you're quite right. They don't have a victim. They do have lots of evidence that he inflated his assets. It's very interesting because, we have 9 million people in New York, and I don't know how many, big stakes businesses and big wigs in the financial world. I'm sure none of them ever inflate their assets. Like Trump is the first one who ever did that and invented this practice.
Yeah, no one's ever done it in the history of business or anything. It's only Trump. Goodness.
Yeah, it's just, it's unbelievable. But what O'Leary said is exactly right. And I say this, look, I grew up in the Bronx. I worked in the city. I love the city. Talking down New York City is like the last thing on the world that I'd want to do. I stay out of the city now because it's hostile to people who believe what I believe. Ooh. And if I had a business, there's no way on earth I would set up a business. And as he said, it's not to do with Trump. It's that if they do this to him, they can do it to anyone. And Trump may be the personal embodiment of everything that progressives hate, but he's not the only thing they hate. And they hate a lot of things about business. They hate a lot of causes. And if they would do this to Trump, there's no reason to think they wouldn't do it to, say, a firearms manufacturer, right, or the fossil fuel industry, or any other thing that they just, whatever the trendy piety of the left happens to be that week, you got a target on your back. So this is really bad for New York. But at the same time, every time I go on a rant about this, I have to hold myself up because unlike the federal system where the president appoints the prosecutors, in the state system, everybody's elected. The prosecutors are elected. Even the judges are elected. This judge is an elected progressive Democratic judge who run unopposed on a slate. So people are getting what they want in New York. This is what they voted for, and it's going to bite them, but they chose it.
And this is just one of a number of cases that Trump is embroiled in. And of course, this is this Manhattan Supreme Court Justice Ingeron, this judge, and with this, I think with the interest in that, it pushes it up above the 100 million in interest, so 455 million. And the argument that any bank or anybody else was defrauded, banks aren't usually silent about that stuff, but nope, nobody ever made a complaint about this at all, which really seems to kind of undermine his ruling here.
Yeah, that's right. They have this monstrous law in New York called Section 6512 of the business law. And what it's really intended for is consumer protection. So it's a method so that if you have a business that's engaged in persistent fraud against consumers under circumstances where, every consumer is paying a few bucks, but nobody has a real interest in taking on the burden financially of suing to recover, you have this thing where the Attorney General's office can jump in that situation. What they've done is they've taken this thing that applies to consumer protection and they've applied it to a situation where everybody involved in these transactions was a sophisticated financial player who was doing his own due diligence. And anybody who thinks do you really think JP Morgan Chase or Deutsche Bank took Donald Trump's word for it that, this is what my assets worth? these guys are in the business of appraising risk. And that's what they do. They don't want to get, they don't want to get stuck on a loan of, some of these loans are, I saw in Forbes today, I think Trump has like a $425 million loan payment that's due this year in connection with Trump Tower. I mean, we're not talking about like everyday transactions. And the thought that these people would either lend Trump that kind of money or cover his insurance risk without doing their own investigation of whether they wanted to buy onto that risk or not is not.
It is crazy. Talking with our good friend Andy McCarthy, is it the way that I understand it for Trump to appeal the verdict in this? Does he have to put up the entire financial penalty here before he can go further?
Plus interest.
Oh
yeah.
my gosh,
So
the whole $455 million, $500 million.
Yeah. And here's where this gets really dicey for him, because we're not talking just about this monstrous verdict that he just got, but on January 26th, the federal jury came in the second E. Jean Carroll case with that $83.3 million, and that's on top of $6 million from last year. So if you accumulate that, just take the interest out, it's almost $500 million even without interest. And in these jurisdictions, whether it's federal court in New York or New York State court, you have 30 days to appeal. Unlike criminal cases, civil cases, you actually have to put up the money to appeal because the court needs to be satisfied that you're not appealing for purposes of delay and that you will pay what you owe if you lose. So he's got to put up the money. Now, he doesn't have to be liquid. He doesn't have to put up a cash amount.
Right.
But if he's going to get bonds, any bondsman is going to require him to secure the bond with an equal or greater amount of property that he can execute on if Trump were to not pay the bond. I mean, that's the way this works, right? So he's either going to have to put up the full amount in order to appeal in cash, or he's got to put up enough that he can get a bond secured by his other property, which is heavily leveraged. And he's got to do it within 30 days, because if you waive your right to appeal, if your 30 days come and go and you don't appeal, then the judgment is final and the plaintiff can start executing on your property, meaning, go to court and try to seize parts of your property if you don't pay the judgment. So, we haven't even gotten to the criminal cases yet.
Oh gosh. And
he's got to manage $500 million in judgments that he wants to appeal, but he's going to have to tie up funds to appeal it. He's got these criminal cases coming. He's rounding up legal fees, which a lot is being paid by campaign contributions, but there's a lot of people who want to challenge that practice because these are private lawsuits. They're not really campaign matters. We haven't even gotten to a criminal trial yet, which is supposed to happen next month. And he's in a real crunch because it's not like his business debts that are existing haven't gone away. He's got to pay those too.
This is one of the most insane things I've ever heard, the way this process works with this. We're talking with our friend, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney, best-selling author, Andy McCarthy, because essentially you have to help the court bankrupt yourself and destroy yourself before you can actually further seek satisfaction and appeal. And I know that some people were asking whether or not the Supreme Court can weigh in. Again, my limited understanding, doesn't he have to appeal before they can even do that too? Doesn't that have to get kicked up to a federal court?
Yeah, that would even have to happen if this was federal. Like ordinarily, even if you were allowed to appeal something from a trial, like this immunity litigation that we just saw in the federal court, you have to go to the Court of Appeals first before you can go to the Supreme Court, right? In a state case, it's even worse than that for the litigant, because you have to run the full gamut of the state system before you can raise any federal appeal. So he's got to go to the appellate division in New York. And if he gets any satisfaction or if he loses there, it probably won't be a clean result one way or the other. Then it goes to the Court of Appeals. In New York, we have the idiotic nomenclature of the trial court in New York is called the Supreme Court, and the highest court in the state is called the Court of Appeals. Go. You want to know why everything's screwed up? It's screwed up even in nomenclature. It's screwed up from the beginning. But he would have to run that whole thing before he could appeal to the Supreme Court. And, a lot of people say maybe the Eighth Amendment applies here. Maybe it's not that he didn't do anything wrong, but the punishment is so out of whack with what the wrong was that maybe there's a federal constitutional claim. And maybe there is, but he's going to have to convince a state court of it before he ever gets to the Supreme Court.
Last question for you. Our good friend Andy McCarthy on the phone with us, a best-selling author, and you see him on Fox, read his stuff on NRO, read his stuff everywhere. It really does, regardless of what one thinks of Trump, or regardless even of where someone falls on the merits or maybe even lack thereof in some of these cases, this does seem, and this is like a downplaying way of saying it, very punitively prohibitive on this is they're out to ruin him. They're out to bankrupt him and make it to where he can't defend himself. I mean, I know you and I talked about the Mar-a-Lago case and some of the documents there, and I think we were in agreement on some of the legal questions there. But this is just crazy. This is just punitive for the sake of being so.
Yeah, and what I find really disturbing about it most of all, especially because I come from the legal culture in New York, such as it was at the turn of the century. I'm not saying which century, but it would have been disqualifying for a prosecutor to try to seek office, as Letitia James did as AG and as Alvin Bragg did as Manhattan DA, to say, if you elect me, I'll use the power of my office against, X person, which is a very Soviet sort of thing to do. And I think 20 years ago, someone who tried to do that would not have any chance of winning office. But now the culture has changed. Progressives are all in favor of using process in a punitive way against the people that they dislike. And when Tish James ran on that platform, she won in a landslide. So this is a cultural thing in New York. It's not just a legal system.
That's a really great point. I mean, and ultimately it means I don't see what pathway to relief he has. I really don't.
No, I don't know. He did get credibly accused of inflating his assets. And the reason I point that out is we don't really know how rich he is. Forbes said he was worth about $2.6 billion, I think, in the most recent appraisal, like 6 months ago. So maybe he's flush enough to fund all this. But this is a monumental challenge. And again, we haven't even gotten to the criminal trials yet. Yeah. And in the criminal trials, he's got to be in court every single day of these trials.
Golly, this is just getting started. Our friend Andy McCarthy, he has a great piece that's just out. It's over at National Review. The Post-Judgment Financial Peril is real. It just dropped. Andy, always appreciate your brilliant insight. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Dana.